All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center webinar on Stalking and the Intersections with Domestic Violence. I'm Lisa Bruner, Program Specialist for NIWRC, and with on the call today are Tang Chim, Technology Specialist for NIWRC, and our presenter, Michelle Garcia. Ms. Garcia joined the Stalking Resource Center at the National Center for Victims of Crime in April of 2006 and has served as the director of the Stalking Resource Center since October of 2006. The mission of the Stalking Resource Center is to enhance the ability of professionals, organizations, and systems to effectively respond to stalking. The Stalking Resource Center envisions a future in which the criminal justice system and its many allied community partners will effectively collaborate and respond to stalking, improve victim safety and well-being, and hold offenders accountable. Prior to joining the National Center, Michelle was a program specialist with the U.S. Department of Justice for Victims of Crime. She has over 20 years of experience working with victims of stalking, sexual assault, and domestic violence in both rural and urban settings, and advocating for victim rights on a local, state, and national level. Michelle has trained internationally on various topics, including stalking, sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and dismantling oppression. She currently serves on the editorial board of the Sexual Assault Report, the American Bar Association Commission on Domestic and Sexual Violence, and the Advisory Board for School and College Organization for Prevention Educators, SCOPE. Michelle received her Master's of Public Policy degree from the University of Chicago. Welcome, Michelle, and thank you for presenting on this important topic today. Tang will explain the technology aspect of the webinar today.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. For those of you that have not attended one of our webinars before, I want to direct your attention to the GoToWebinar control panel, which should be on the right side of your screen. Of particular attention I want to bring is the audio section, where at any time during today's presentation, should your audio start to waver or have issues, open up that little section, and then you can click on telephone and then back to mic and speakers to reconnect to the session to try to establish a better connection. If that continues to give you issues, just click on to telephone, and it will display a phone number and a PIN in which you can use to connect to the audio portion. The other section on the control panel is the questions, where you can go ahead and type in any questions you may have during the today's session. During today's session, we also have 2 polls that you'll be asked to participate in addition to being able to raise your hand. So on the control panel, you should have a little icon that looks like a hand in which you can click on to raise your hand. So please do so at the appointed time when our presenter asks you to. Other than that, I hope you enjoyed today's session.
Thank you so much, Lisa and Tang. It is a pleasure to be here with everyone today. As Lisa said, my name is Michelle Garcia, and I'm the director of the Stalking Resource Center at the National Center for Victims of Crime. And we are a nonprofit organization that is funded by the U.S. Department of Justice to work with professionals, organizations, agencies, and communities to enhance the ability to respond to stalking. And so much of what we do are provide trainings such as these around the ability to recognize and effectively respond to stalking. And we're thrilled to be doing this webinar series with the National Indian Women's Resource Center, this first one on stalking and the intersection with domestic violence, to be followed by one next Wednesday on the use of technology to stalk, and the Wednesday after that on working with victims of stalking. Tang, I'm having some issues with advancing the slides, so can you confirm that I actually have control?
Go ahead and click inside of the slide window, and then you should be able to re-engage the controls. There you are.
All right, thank you. So to give folks a little bit of an overview of where we're going to go today, we want to start out by defining stalking, because one of the things we know is that the behaviors can look very different, our laws are different, and so I want to start with a common definition that we can all use. We'll look at how frequently stalking occurs in our communities, the dynamics involved in stalking, and then really focus in on the intersection between stalking and domestic violence. And then look at what some of the effects of this is on victims. And we'll have time at the end for any questions and answers. Throughout the presentation, if you find that you have questions, please go ahead and use the chat feature to ask questions, and we will come back to those questions at the end of the presentation. So before we jump into the content, I'd actually like to get a bit of a sense of the experience of folks who are participating. So using the raise your hand feature, please raise your hand if you have worked with a stalking victim or offender previously. And Tang, can you give me a sense of what that looks like?
Tallying it up right now. So over half of our participants today.
Okay, great. So over half of you have previously worked with a victim or offender, so it seems like there's already a good amount of experience with the folks here. So definitely, as we go forward, please feel free to use the chat feature to talk about the types of things that you're seeing in the cases that you've worked or the victims that you're working with, the challenges that you're facing, because we really want to be able to meet your needs. So as I said, where we'd like to actually start is first with just defining stalking. What is it? And we're going to look at a couple different ways in which we can define stalking, both as a behavior, but then also statutorily. What do our laws say stalking is? So starting from a behavioral perspective, the definition that we use, that we've actually borrowed from the National Institutes for Justice, is that stalking is a pattern of behavior directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. Now, a few things about this definition. First of all, pattern of behavior, something that occurs more than once. And in fact, all of our laws on stalking require more than one incident. It's something that's directed at a specific person that would cause a person to feel fear. Many of our laws are talk about what is the impact on the victim or what is the impact on a reasonable person. And you'll notice in this definition that there's nothing specifically about the intent of the offender. Because in thinking about it, if you asked an offender if they intended to cause fear, so often they're going to say, no, of course not. I was just doing this because I love her or I love him. I'm trying to get back together with them. I want to make sure that they're okay. But that fear piece is really critical because it does tend to be the element that legally distinguishes stalking from other crimes, like, say, harassment. But it's also one of the most challenging components because fear is subjective. It is a difficult aspect of the crime of stalking because we are not all afraid of the same things. What might be terrifying to me might seem benign and harmless to you. We also know that frequently people don't readily admit to being fearful. In our society, there's often a stigma associated with being afraid, and there's some definite gendered aspects that. And so frequently we have folks who will not articulate that they're afraid or admit that they're afraid. People also react very differently to fear. Some people, it becomes very externalized. They may be clearly sad, anxious, hysterical, where people turn very quiet, they shut down. And so fear may be demonstrated differently. And in some cases, with some of our laws, when we talk about this behavior that causes someone fear, sometimes we actually have was the offender's intent, that they were engaging in these behaviors with the intention of causing fear. And like I said, if you ask most offenders, they're not necessarily going to admit that that's why they're doing it, even though they may know those are consequences of their actions. It's really all about the context of the behavior. Context is really critical in stalking cases. That, again, we want to look at what is this, we have to put ourselves in that victim's shoes, the meaning of the behavior is to them. We also know, stalking within this context of domestic violence, that within a relationship there may be certain behaviors or gestures or looks that have a meaning that is only understood between that offender and to the victim, and to any not have that same understanding. And we also know that stalking can criminalize behaviors that independently are not criminal. So really what we're looking at doing is, in essence, putting together a puzzle that we can take numerous behaviors that occur within this course of conduct, again, that individually may not be criminal behaviors, sending someone a text message, showing up in a public place, posting on someone's social media, in and of themselves in most cases are not criminal acts, but when we start to see them in context, when we view them as a full course of conduct, then we start seeing this behavior emerging that we can think about as stalking. So it's really important that we see all of these behaviors in context. So this is how we can think about stalking as a behavior. How it's actually been legislated have been in a number of different ways. We have lots of different types of laws around stalking. So there are federal stalking statutes. Every state, the District of Columbia, and all the U.S. territories have stalking statutes. It's been codified within the UCMJ, the Uniform Code for Military Justice. And also numerous tribes have enacted codes specifically around stalking. And numerous tribes have shared their codes with us. And so you can look at our various laws, whether they're state or federal or tribal, and you can see how we define stalking. And often you'll see language within these codes that actually mirror that behavioral definition to some degree. If you're interested in looking at either your state stalking statute or your tribe's code around stalking, if we have it, please visit our website. On our website, we try and maintain all of the stalking laws that we're aware of. If your tribe does have a code on stalking and you would like to have it added to our website, please contact us. We would be happy to add and share that information as well. So I asked how many of you have had an opportunity to work with a stalking victim or an offender, and about half of you said you had. Well, let's see how reflective that is of the prevalence of stalking in our society. So we're going to have our first poll for you. So this is an opportunity for you to interact. So the question is, how many people are stalked in 1 year in the United States? And choose one of the answers, either A, 1.2 million, 3.4 million, 4.5 million, or 6.6 million. So please go ahead and cast your choice, and we'll give folks just a few seconds to vote, and then we'll see the results. All right, take just a few more seconds, and then Tang, if you'd like to go ahead and publish the results. All right, so what we find are about 5% of people said 1.2 million. We have nearly a third saying 3.4 million. And 41% said 4.5 million, and about a quarter said 6.6 million. So we have folks all over the place. What we know is that about 6.6 million people are stalked every year in the United States. Now, how do we know this? Is this based on reports of stalking? No, we know stalking is underreported. This is actually based on research. In 2011, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention released the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey, also called the NISVIS, a large-scale national survey around the issues of sexual violence, intimate partner violence, and stalking. And what they found was that in a 1 year period, 6.6 million people had been stalked. over the course of a lifetime, that broke down to about 1 in 6 women and 1 in 19 men will be stalked at some point in their life. Things about those numbers. First of all, they only surveyed adults, so individuals 18 and over. And based on what we know from other research and also just from working with youth, we know stalking is happening at ages younger than 18. So this will be very much a conservative estimate. And when we look at who our victims are, we know that there's also the reality that anyone can be a stalking victim, but there are certain individuals who are more likely to be stalked. So amongst adults, oh, and let me just point out, if you want to calculate the prevalence of stalking in your own community, or if you work with a college or university on your campus, you can take the population of your community, divide by 1,000, multiply by 26.5, and you'll get that statistical estimate of how many stalking cases are occurring in your community each year. But again, keeping in mind that we're looking only at adults, so the actual number probably would be higher. And when we look at who our victims are, we know that amongst adults, young adults, 18 to 24-year-olds experience the highest rates of stalking victimization, that women are more likely to be stalked, nearly 3 times more likely to be stalked than men. Conversely, though, when we look at who our offenders are, what we find is that overall, most stalkers tend to be male, but when we break it down by gender of the victim, what we find are some differences. For female victims, they're most likely to be stalked by a male. For male victims, they're equally likely to be stalked by a male or a female. And I'll explore that a little bit more in just a moment. I do want to acknowledge that throughout my presentation, because the reality is that most of our victims tend to be female and most of our offenders tend to be male, my language is going to reflect that. But I don't in any way want to discount the reality that absolutely females can be offenders and absolutely we see many male victims. We also know that most victims and offenders know each other in some capacity, that most of the time they're not going to be strangers, and we'll explore that relationship a little bit more in just a moment. And when we look at the race of stalking victims, we know it can happen to individuals of any race or ethnicity. But what we find, and not dissimilar to what we know about rates of sexual assault, sexual violence, and domestic violence within tribal communities, is that the rates of stalking amongst American Indian and Alaska Natives tends to be disproportionately higher than other races or ethnicities. Now, we also find that individuals identifying as more than one race have the highest rates, but partially we can attribute this to the fact that many, many more people these days do identify as being more than one race. And when we look at the relationships between victims and offenders, like I said, most of the time they're going to know each other in some capacity. So they may be a person of authority. This is defined as someone like a coach or a teacher. It could be a family member. We have had a case of a cousin stalking a cousin. We had another case of an adult grandchild stalking a grandparent. It can be an acquaintance. So it could be a neighbor. It could be a coworker. It could be a classmate. It could be that person that you see at the grocery store every week. So someone that you just casually know. But in most of our cases, it's going to be a current or former intimate partner. And you'll see that for female victims, that's over 2/3. But for our male victims, it's pretty much equally likely to be stalker or former intimate partner or an acquaintance. And to some degree, that accounts for some of the gender differences between victims and offenders. Because one of the things we often see in stalking cases is that our stalkers will most of the time have a primary victim, but they also may stalk other people around that victim. So friends, family members, folks who are trying to intervene on behalf of that victim. We've worked with law enforcement, prosecutors, judges who have been stalked by the offenders in cases that they've investigated or prosecuted or presided over. But in thinking about some of the male-on-male stalking, one of the things we frequently see are cases have a male primary female victim who is also stalking that female victim's new love interest. So it's going to be the ex-boyfriend, ex-partner, ex-spouse who's stalking the victim's new boyfriend, new partner, new spouse. So we see lots of different types of relationships that may exist between victims and offenders. And when we think about what is it that victims are actually experiencing, when victims are asked, what are the stalking behaviors that are most frequently occurring, the types of things that victims say are probably the behaviors that all of us think of when we think of stalking. The unwanted phone calls, voicemails, text messages, the unwanted emails or letters showing up the victim is at, watching them, following them, leaving things, rumors. List of behaviors, typically in and of themselves, largely these are not criminal behaviors. It's not a crime by itself to send someone a text message or to show up in a public place or to leave somebody a voicemail or to leave someone a gift or to spread a rumor. Most of the behaviors that are going to make up stalking by themselves are not going to be criminal acts. It's only when we start to see them within that context as a full course of conduct that we can start to think of these behaviors as stalking behaviors. And when we think about stalking these days in the 21st century, we have to think about technology. Because in our experience, it is really rare these days to have a stalking case that doesn't involve some form of technology, even if it's as simple as the cell phone. And so the webinar that we're going to do next week will really dive into some of the most common forms of technology that we see stalkers using and misusing to stalk their victims. We know that the majority of offenders will pursue their victim at least once a week, in many cases more frequently, daily, multiple times daily. Most stalkers will use more than one means of approach. So they'll text the victim 100 times a day and show up at the victim's workplace, or they'll call repeatedly and damage the victim's property. And often they'll change their tactics depending on whether they get the response that they're looking for. Now, in most stalking cases, we don't see weapons actually being used. It's only about 1 in 5. We also know that these offenders do not take no for an answer, that they can also be very creative in what they do and how they do it. So we will see offenders who do things like use children. So if the victim and the offender have children in common, the offender may use the children to gather information or to actually deliver some of the technologies that we're going to talk about next week. They may use the legal system to harass that victim. So I met a stalking victim last year who had been stalked for over 28 years by her ex-husband, and they have a child in common. And so for the first 18 years of that child's life, the offender, who still had joint custody of the child, would repeatedly take the victim to court on all sorts of frivolous motions, not ostensibly about that child and that child's care, but it would be things like, you had their hair cut without asking my permission, you bought the wrong types of sneakers for school. And it was more about getting into court with that victim, being able to stand 6 feet away from them. So often they'll misuse and abuse the legal system. They'll violate orders of protection. Like I said, these offenders don't take no for an answer. They don't stop when the victim says stop. They don't stop when law enforcement says stop. And they don't stop when the court says stop. When the court says you can no longer have contact. In most cases, stalkers violate orders of protection. And in some cases, they will actually commit other crimes. And we'll explore that a little bit more in just a moment. Sometimes stalkers will get other people to help them. So what we consider stalking by proxy or third-party stalking. They'll get someone else to help them or assist in their stalking behavior. Sometimes these third parties don't even recognize that they're being used this way. We worked with a stalking victim who was being stalked by her now ex-husband, and when they first separated and he moved out of the home that they shared, one of the things that he did was contact one of their neighbors, who he would call and he would ask, you know, I'm I imagine you know that I'm not in the house right now. We're working on some things in our marriage, but I want to make sure she and their children, I want to make sure she and the girls are okay. So would you mind looking out the window and telling me, is her car in the driveway? Did she get home okay from work today? And this neighbor who thought she was doing a good thing, a helpful thing, would tell him whenever he called, yes, she's home. No, she's not home. Facilitating his. Now, sometimes they don't know they're being used that way. Sometimes friends or family do know. They're asked by the offender to assist, and it is intentional. When we look at intimate partner stalking victims, more than half say, yes, somebody else was involved. And there's a very high recidivism rate amongst stalkers. Again, they don't take no for an answer. When we look at the rates of domestic violence reabuse, what we find is that it occurs in about a quarter to nearly 2/3 of cases, and that the majority of offenders do so within 6 months of beginning probation or batterer program. So when there's some sort of intervention happening. With stalking cases, what we find is recidivism occurs in nearly 2/3 of all stalking cases when some sort of intervention is happening. And when I say intervention, I mean like the offender's been arrested, they've been charged with stalking, they're on probation, they're subject to a criminal no contact order. And in nearly 2/3 of the cases, the stalker will reoffend, most commonly 1 day later. 1 day after being arrested, 1 day after being served with an order of protection, 1 day after being charged, they are right back stalking that victim. There's a really high rate of recidivism with our stalkers. And we know these cases can last a long time. What we find on average is that a stalking case lasts just under 2 years. For intimate partner stalking victims, they tend to last longer. And like I mentioned, there was a stalking victim I met last year who had been stalked for nearly 3 decades by her ex. So we know that this can have a long-term impact on victims' lives. And as I mentioned, stalking intersects with other crimes. So frequently, stalking isn't necessarily happening in a vacuum. That some of the other crimes that we may see occur include things like property damage. We know that damage to the car is the most common form of property damage in stalking cases. And so for any participants who may be law enforcement, one of the things we encourage is if you're ever taking a report of damage to property, damage to a car, ask additional questions about any other behavior you've been experiencing, because there may be a chance that this is part of something broader. This is part of a stalking case. We see actual attacks on a victim or on somebody else or a pet. And we also see financial crimes occurring. Identity theft we're seeing more and more frequently in stalking cases, where you have offenders who are charging charges to a victim's credit card or stealing money from a victim's account or closing accounts or opening new accounts. And we can see how this might be particularly easy in cases where the victim and the offender know each other, where there is that prior relationship, because that offender might have access to the victim's financial accounts or to the information to open or close those accounts. And so we've talked about how most victims and offenders know each other, and most frequently it's going to be that current or former. So it shouldn't be too surprising then when we do start seeing a connection between stalking and domestic violence. And the research that is out there actually bears this out. So what we find is that the majority of victims who were stalked by an intimate partner had also been physically assaulted by that partner. Again, stalking doesn't happen in a vacuum. We often see that it'll co-occur with other types of sexual physical violence. About a relationship where this type of violence is occurring, and we start to think about when stalking occurs within that relationship. Does the stalking typically begin before the relationship ends while the victim is still in the relationship, or does the stalking typically begin after the relationship ends? And I think you can think of examples probably from victims that you worked with where it could go either way. And what we find is that in about 57 cases, we see the stalking is actually occurring before the relationship ends. And for anyone who's worked with a domestic violence with many of these behaviors, there are many things that abusers and batterers do that we can think of as stalking. Things like repeatedly calling a victim to see where they're at, who they're with, when they're going to be home, showing up at the victim's workplace or their class, or when they're with friends or relatives, doing things like checking their call logs, reading their text messages, reading their emails, looking at their calendars, looking at their financial records, using technology like putting a GPS tracker on the victim's car so they can see everywhere they go. These are all absolutely things that we know abusers do. And it is part of that domestic violence. But it is also stalking behavior. And it's really critical that we actually name it as stalking behavior, because one of the things we know is that intimate partner stalkers are the most dangerous type of stalkers. They pose an increased risk for victims. We know that intimate partner stalkers are more likely to physically approach that victim, so they will actually physically pursue and approach them. They can be more insulting and interfering and threatening, and this makes sense, right? It's your partner who knows those things about you that can make you afraid, who knows how to be really insulting, who knows what they can do to upset you. Earlier, we saw that most stalkers tend not to use weapons. However, our intimate partner stalkers are more likely to use weapons. They're also more likely to escalate their behaviors quickly and to reoffend. So even within those very high recidivism rates, our intimate partner stalkers are more likely to reoffend. We also know separate from the offender. So many of us have heard that for a domestic violence victim, it takes an average 7 attempts before they can completely leave the relationship. Well, what we find is that when stalking is involved, more separation attempts occur than when it is intimate partner violence alone without any stalking behavior. So when we see that presence of stalking, it's going to take victims actually more attempts to complete dangerous to the victims, but they're also more dangerous to other people around them. Intimate partner stalking victims have the highest risk of violence from a stalker. And there are certain red flags that we can begin to look for. These include when you have someone who issued direct threats of violence, when you have an offender who is jealous of the victim's relationships with other people while they were in a relationship. So this we see so frequently within domestic violence, that jealousy of everybody. They're jealous of the victim's relationship with anybody, friends, family, coworkers, sometimes their own children. And when you have an offender who's a user of illegal drugs, when all three of these factors are present, the risk of violence is heightened for that victim. We also know that there is a threat of lethality in stalking cases. When we look at some of the research that has been done around femicide or the murder of a woman, what we find is that 3 out of 4 of the cases where women were murdered by a current or former intimate partner, they had been stalked in the 12 months prior to their murder. Now, let me be clear. I'm not saying 3 out of 4 stalking victims are going to be murdered, but in the overwhelming number of cases of what the media likes to call domestic homicides, what we find is that stalking is preceding those homicides. And in 85% of the attempted murders, there was stalking in the 12 months prior to the attempt. When we start to delve down into this research and look for those connections with the physical violence, what we find is that over 2/3 of the women who had been murdered had been physically abused by their intimate partner in the year prior to their murder. Of those that were physically abused, nearly 90% had also been stalked. What we know is that the combination of physical abuse and stalking poses a much higher risk of lethality than either of those behaviors alone, which is why it's so critical that we name the stalking behavior for what it is. And I think this is almost intuitive. And I think about when I joined the Stalking Resource Center, I had been working in domestic violence and sexual assault for over 15 years. And when I started really delving into the stalking pieces, I started thinking back to every domestic violence victim survivor that I had worked with. And I would say stalking was occurring in over 99% of their cases. We just never called it stalking. It was part of the domestic violence. It was part of the tactics that or regain control. And yes, it absolutely is part of those tactics, but it's also stalking. And this is the reason we have to actually name that behavior as stalking, because those victims face such great risk for harm. So what is the impact of all of this on victims? What are the effects? Well, we have another poll for you. In thinking about what are victims most afraid of, when victims are asked, what are you most afraid of? What do you think they say? Do you think victims are most afraid of bodily harm, not knowing what will happen next, death, or losing one's mind? So please choose one answer from the poll. What do you think stalking victims are most afraid of? Bodily harm, not knowing what will happen next, death, or losing one's mind? And register their answer, and then Tang will go ahead and publish the results. All right, take just a few more seconds, and then Tang, if you want to publish our results. All right, so we have about 7% of folks who said bodily harm. The overwhelming majority of people said not knowing what will happen next. Nearly 10% said death, and about 6% said losing one's mind. And nice job. It is not knowing what will happen next. When stalking victims were asked, what is it that you're most afraid of? What we found was that nearly half said not knowing what would happen next. It's that uncertainty, not knowing when the offender will show up again, when their phone is going to ring, what's going to be waiting for them when they open their email. It's that loss of control over their life, the constant uncertainty. Nearly a third said bodily harm, that the behavior would never stop, that someone else would be harmed, that their child would be harmed, that they've lost their freedom, that they've become prisoners in their own home. They don't go out, they don't go to work, they don't go to the gym, they don't socialize with friends because they're afraid of that offender showing up. And for nearly 10%, they believe the only way that this is going to end is in their own death. And I hear from victims all the time that I feel like I'm going crazy. I feel like I'm losing my mind. And when we think about all of these types of behaviors that we've been talking about, they really are crazy-making behaviors, that the levels and the effects that they can have on victims are widespread. When we look at the stalking on victims, we see so many different types of responses and negative effects that this can happen on victims. Some of the most common responses we see are minimization, that victims actually will minimize what they're experiencing. Things like they'll say, it's not that big of a deal, it's just some text messages or some emails, or I know this person, they would never really hurt me, they're just upset that we broke up. they just need some time to get over it, or if I ignore them, they'll go away. So that minimizing the impact of stalking on their lives or the risk that they may be facing. Shock, fear, anxiety. Anxiety is one of the most common stalking. It makes perfect sense, right? If we think about all these types of behaviors that we've been talking about, if you're experiencing those, yes, absolutely, your anxiety level is going to go up. They may change how they interact with people, become more isolated, disengage. They may have difficulty concentrating or maintaining attention. And in the grand scheme of all these, that may not seem like a big deal, difficulty concentrating. But when we're talking about, say, students or within the concept of a workplace, if you can't concentrate, you can't be academically or professionally successful. And so that can have further consequences. Some victims will develop depression. Some will develop post-traumatic stress disorder, changes in sleeping habits and eating habits, fluctuations in weight. And so we can see a lot of different types of effects that stalking have on victims. And some of these effects are really important to keep in mind when we think about the work that we do with victims, whether we're law enforcement or victim service providers, prosecutors, whatever our role is. If we're having interactions with victims, we really need to be mindful of the different types of responses that victims may be experiencing and how that will affect their ability to engage with us, to provide us with information. Because one of the things we have learned very well in the past decade or so have been the effects of trauma on the brain and the ability to recall information, really looking at the neurobiology of trauma. And so when we're talking about stalking, you're talking about victims who are experiencing multiple and repeated traumatic incidents. And we know that one of the consequences is that traumatic memory is stored in the brain differently than day-to-day memory. That process is not the same as when we store just regular day-to-day memories. And so that memory is not accessible in the same ways. There may be holes, there may be gaps. A victim may recall something that happened at one moment in time and not at another. And when we think about victims going and reporting what is happening to them, often what we're seeking is this really linear, chronological narrative of what happened. But in most cases, we're not going to get that. And when we look at stalking in particular, where we see some of the challenges are that stalking often will be occurring for a long period of time before victims ever report, whether it's to law enforcement or seeking assistance from victim service providers. And so then when we ask them to create any sort of chronological or linear narrative, it becomes really difficult. And you'll have victims who will be talking about an incident that happened last week, and then something that happened 2 months ago, and then something that was just a few hours ago. And then they're talking about something that happened over a couple summers ago, and they may be all over the place. And you talk to them one time, and then you talk to them again, and suddenly they recall this huge incident that they never mentioned the last time you talked to them. Those are all of the effects of trauma, and we can see that in these impacts on stalking victims. And so in our third webinar, we'll talk about some of the ways that we can work with victims to try and create some of those chronological and linear narratives that may be beneficial if a victim is choosing to report to law enforcement or choosing to seek an order of protection, because we have to take the impact of all of this into account. And it's not just the physical, the psychological effects. There's also often real effects for victims. So when we look at victims who are employed, what we find is that victims are losing time from work. They're losing time from work to do things like avoid the stalker. So the workplace, or they're showing up at the workplace, and so the victim is not going to work because they're concerned for their own safety or that they're disrupting the work environment. they may be taking time off because they need to go to court, either to get some type of protection order or to testify in a criminal case, or just to deal with things like having to get a new phone number or relocate to get away from the offender, to fix property that the offender is damaging. So we see this break down into actual dollars lost for that victim. Many victims that we talk to talk about concerns about telling their employer if they're experiencing any stalking behavior because they're afraid of the effects that it may have on their career. There's actually a stalking victim that we worked with many years ago who, at one point while she was being stalked, she was essentially fired. Her employer asked her not to return to work because they thought her presence posed too great a risk to the other employees. And so here she was a victim of stalking, and she lost her job because of it. Now, the good news is more and more states are enacting or have enacted protection for stalking, sexual assault victims, both around employment and around housing. So you can't get fired just because you're a victim. You can't be evicted from your home just simply because you're a victim. And so it's great that more and more states have put those protections into place, because when you're experiencing this type of victimization, you don't need that additional concern that could this cost me my job? Could this cost me my home? I could go on and on about the effects or the impacts of stalking, but I think it impactful to actually hear from victims themselves. One victim says, "It's not easy to describe the fear you have when you see the stalker or signs of the stalker everywhere you go. I've given up all hopes of ever having a safe life. For the rest of my life, I'll be looking over my shoulder expecting to see him there." For victims, behaviors end, the concern, the anxiety, the fear doesn't. It may stay with a victim because they're always looking over that shoulder, waiting to see when that offender might show up again. And given the recidivism rates, everything it is not a natural concern. We have seen cases where stalkers have reappeared after months, and in some cases even years. And so for so many victims, this is something that stays with them for the rest of their life. I'm going to go ahead and pause here and see if folks have questions about anything that we've talked about. And so if you do have any questions, please use the feature. And if you'd like me to be able to see the question, please make sure that you send the chat to one of the options that includes presenter.
Okay, hi, Michelle. And the question was, what is the percentage of stalking among college students?
So good question. What is the percentage of stalking amongst college students? What we actually find is that the rates of stalking on college and university campuses tends to be higher than in the general population. So when we go back and we look at the prevalence rates across the general population, what we find is that, like I said, it's about 1 in 6 women and 1 in 19 men. What we find on campuses is that it's closer to about 1 in 4 women and about 1 in 13 men. And those rates are fairly similar across some other college students, but in general, the rates on college and university campuses are higher than the general population. And this is very similar to both dating violence, domestic violence, and sexual assault. We know that the rates of all of these crimes are much higher on college and university campuses than in our general population. Good question.
Thank you. We have a comment, and it says, it's been 12 years, and my stalkers still occasionally try to reach out to me.
Yes, unfortunately, first let me say I'm sorry that that's still happening, and unfortunately that is a reality we hear from many victims, that these offenders in some cases never completely go away, that they will still attempt to make contact. There's a woman that I work with who does elder abuse work, and she was telling me about a client that she was working with who one of the issues this woman was dealing with was that she had been stalked by someone for over 50 years. She went on a date with this man once when they were in college, and 50 years later, he continues to stalk her to try and make contact with her. And so it's an unfortunate reality for so many victims.
Okay, and then I think you touched on this a little bit, but if you could clarify a little bit more. So are there laws to protect victims in the workplace?
So, good question about if there's laws to protect victims in the workplace. It depends on your state. So some states have enacted legislation to provide protections for victims of domestic violence, sexual violence, and stalking in the workplace. There's a great organization. Well, actually, let me give you two resources. First, there's a great resource that Futures Without Violence has published called Workplaces Respond to Domestic and Sexual Violence and Stalking, even though it's not in the title. If you just do an online search for Workplaces Respond to Domestic and Sexual Violence, Futures Without Violence, Workplaces, you can find their website, which has lots of great resources around workplace-based stalking, DV, sexual assault. It has information about protections in place. It also has a great tool that you can use to generate a workplace policy around these issues. So that's one great resource. Another resource is Legal Momentum. They're an organization out of New York, and I believe that they actually have a compilation of all of the state protections, workplace and housing protections for domestic violence, sexual violence, and stalking victims. And if you have any difficulty finding any of these resources, don't hesitate to reach out to me, and I can definitely point you in the right direction. This is our website, our URL. We've got lots of information and resources on our site, as well as links to some of these other resource providers.
Okay, thank you. Catherine, I hope that helps answer your question about requiring employers of DV, which would also include stalking victims.
Yeah, and one thing I'll add is there are many employers who, like I said, there are some states that actually have put laws into place that protect victims from being fired, being demoted, things like that. But even if your state isn't a state that has those sort of legal protections, you know, if you're working in your community, if you are an employer, if you are part of the business and have the ability to have some effect on the policies of that organization, you know, go back and look. Does your workplace have a workplace domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking policy? What are the protections that are part of those policies? And if you don't have an existing policy, go to that workplace's response. Policymakers can just go in and plug in some basic information about their company, how large it is, what location it's located in, and it'll actually create a policy template for that particular company. So it's a tremendous resource. So even if there isn't, say, a state statute in place providing those protections, we can all work within our own communities and advocate within our own organizations or organizations we work with that those companies put those protections in place.
Okay, great, thank you. We have a question that comes in two parts. What is the percentage of women stalked by non-intimate partners? And what is, well, I'll let you answer that first.
Okay, so when we look at, specifically when we look at women and the percent of intimate partners, it's going to be right around 40%. So if we go back and if we looked at the chart, and I don't want to flip all the way back, but it was one of the earlier ones. If we go back and we look at the current or former intimate partners, what we find is about 66 victims are stalked by a current or former intimate partner. So what we see is really, it's just under 40% for females are non-intimate partners. And that can be acquaintances, it can be family members, it can be those persons of authority, it could be strangers. But for female victims, it's going to be about 40% will be non-intimate partners, either current or former.
Thank you. Second question. What is the best method for obtaining a restraining order or a peace order when you have no relationship with the stalker?
So also really great question, and it's one of the things that we do see changing fairly quickly across the country. So if we look at most states, and as well as within many tribal codes, what we find are domestic violence victims can get some sort of order of protection or restraining order, no contact order. But it has those relationship requirements, right? It's typically have been married, have cohabitated, have children, and in some jurisdictions, it may also include have had a dating relationship. But for the friend, the coworker, the classmate, the neighbor, they wouldn't qualify for those. So what we've actually seen are more and more states who are enacting stalking specific protection orders. Right now, there's a little over a dozen states that have enacted stalking specific protection orders that do not have any sort of relationship requirement, so that really anyone who's being stalked, regardless of the relationship with the offender, can attempt to get one of the protection orders. And we see more states and jurisdictions. Look, on our website, if you go to our website, victims-src, there's actually a page that we have around laws, and one section of that includes protection orders, and there's a chart there that actually details which states provide any type of protection for stalking victims. So this could either be a standalone stalking specific protection order that doesn't have any relationship requirement, or it could also include states that include stalking within the behaviors under which someone is eligible for a domestic violence order protection. So we're starting to see some movement. I would love to see every state, every territory, every jurisdiction provide the availability for someone to get an order of protection without that relationship requirement if they're experiencing stalking behavior. And we're moving in that direction. But again, legislative process in most cases is not the quickest process. So look at your state, see what's available. And again, if you have specific questions about how that's working in your state, definitely reach out to us. We'd be happy to talk with you about that more.
Thank you. Are there any thoughts or questions, participants?
And as people are thinking about if any additional questions or comments, I just do want to give a brief overview of what our next webinars will be. So the 7th, we'll be looking at the intersection between stalking and sexual assault. I'm sorry, the use of technology to stalk. I don't know where that slide went. So we're going to focus on some of the most common technologies that we see stalkers using. So in the time that we have, there's no way that we can talk about every form of technology that stalkers are using. So we'll focus on some of the most common ones that include cell phones, computers, GPS devices, location-based applications, and we'll also talk about considerations around how victims can engage with the technology, collect evidence around the technology. So we'll address several concepts around the technology. And then on September 3rd, we'll talk about taking all of this information and how do you put it into practice in working with victims of stalking. So we'll look at some considerations around safety for victims. We'll look at assessing risk and threat that stalking victims might be facing. So we'll talk about some of the more dangerous times for stalking victims, as well as some of the more dangerous offenders. We'll look at some that are available out there. We'll look at the importance of advocacy and support services, and then talk about safety plan. How can we do safety planning in stalking cases? How can we work to try and enhance victim safety? So that's a brief overview of the next two webinars that we're doing in this series. Like I said, again, next Wednesday and then the following Wednesday.
Thank you, Michelle. We have another question. How would you address stalking criminal statutes?
How would I suggest addressing stalking offenses when stalking is not specifically part of your jurisdiction's criminal statutes? Well, I would say look at your code and see, are there other offenses that may encapsulate stalking behavior? So do you have a harassment offense? Do you have a menacing offense? Do you have certain offenses that may address specific behavior like illegal wiretapping or unlawful surveillance or voyeurism? So often when we look at the behaviors that our offenders are engaging in, even if you don't have a specific stalking statute in your jurisdiction, are there other types of codes that address some of those particular behaviors? Often harassment we'll see, but then thinking creatively around what might be some other things we could look at, and also keeping in mind that often offenders will commit other crimes. Are they committing property damage? Are they committing burglary or robbery, stealing items from the victim or from the victim's home or car or workplace? Are they making threats? Threatening behavior may in and of itself be a crime. Are they committing physical assaults or attacks? So looking at what are the range, have something in your statutes, in your codes that could address those behaviors if you don't specifically have a stalking law. And then I would also encourage work with your lawmakers to enact a stalking statute needed. One of the resources that we've provided several years ago is a template for stalking laws. It's called the Model Stalking Code, and that's another resource that's download on our website.
Thank you, Michelle. And in thinking about that question, especially that in tribal communities, you would look at if the tribe doesn't have a code specifically in place for that. And of course, it depends on the jurisdiction in which you're in. Are you in a public to a state, to a state in those capacities? What laws are in place that can be used to help create a response to that particular victim of stalking? And again, it's just the Stalking Resource Center is just an incredible resource for all different types of capacities for helping with the code development. So looking at the tribal piece, there are some amazing codes that are just very simplistic, and sometimes that's all you need. It doesn't need to be overly complicated. That could be introduced to the tribe or whomever in the tribe that addresses that particular piece. But then also going to, are you in a particular county? If there's no codes that are there, just start having the conversations with the right people, going to city councils, whatever it may be, just to begin that dialogue. Because I think a lot of times stalking is not seen as such a serious offense when everything that Michelle had covered definitely states otherwise, especially intimate partner violence and the lethality factor. Especially intimate partner violence, and
to recreate the wheel. Many of these codes have been enacted in other places, and I mentioned the model code. There have been about it to share their tribal codes with us, and those are on our website as well. And so, if you're looking to enact something for your own tribe in your own jurisdiction, see what's already out there. You may find something that you think will work very well in your jurisdiction as well. So you don't need to create it from scratch. And if you do want to create it from scratch, we're happy to work with you. That if you want to draft something and want our feedback, we're happy to provide it and provide suggestions about where we think something could be strengthened or changed. So that's absolutely a resource that we can provide as well.
Okay, and then we have a request. It says, can you send me the link to the workplace website you were talking about? I can't seem to find it.
I can. What I can do is, Lisa, what would be the best way for me to get that to you, to get to people?
If you send it to me, Tang will be able to send out to all the participants.
Okay. Yeah, what I will do is I will send Tang both the Workplaces Respond as well as the Legal Momentum links, and then he can push those out to everybody.
Awesome. Okay, we have another question. Are there any programs out there to help a victim change their name and Social Security?
There are some programs out there, and we often hear this from victims around the possibility you're exploring the options of relocating, doing a name change, doing a Social Security change, and I would caution folks to always take a step back, because with the total relocation and identity change becomes very difficult. And also there's a couple different ways in how you can change your Social Security number and some consequences associated with that. The National Network to End Domestic Violence and Greater Boston Legal Services have been working on a project for the last couple years around relocation issues. And there's some is on the National Network to End Domestic Violence's website that I sent to Tang to distribute. But I also want to do a little bit of a plug. We're looking in October to actually do a webinar with Valenda Applegarth, who is with Greater Boston Legal Services, who is probably the relocation expert in the country, to talk about stalking and some of the options and benefits and risks associated with doing things like name change and Social Security number change.
Okay, great, thank you. We have another question. What is the percentage rate of stalking for 50 and over, male and female?
For which age and older?
50?
50?
Yep.
I don't have that right at my fingertips. I can definitely look it up. What we do find is that the prevalence rates tend to decrease as age increases. But the exact number I don't have off the top of my head, but I can again get that and provide it to Tang and do just an age breakdown, and he can push that out.
Okay, great, thank you. We just had a question if CLEs were available. We're not available to be able to provide that at this time, so I apologize for that.
And Lisa, I imagine this question came up. Are you all going to be providing folks with a copy of the presentation?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Tang has, for everybody, if you look at the chat box, Tang has sent out, so the slides from today's webinar are available on the website, so it's there. He also has the National Network to End Domestic Violence website, but you can also register for the next 2 webinars as well. And if it said that on our website that August 27th, September 3rd, say the webinar is the use of technology to stalk. That would be, as what's displayed, August Wednesday's webinar series, and then the following is working with victims of stalking on September 3rd. Okay. Any other thoughts or questions? Okay, we have another one. Do you have any stats about the intersections between stalking and sexual violence?
We actually do. So when we look at national studies, what they found is that about 2% of stalking victims report that they were also raped or sexually assaulted by the stalker. When we look at intimate partner stalking victims, about 31% report that they were also sexually assaulted by the offender. But one of the interesting things about the research that's typically been done in this area is the question has always been asked from the perspective of asking stalking victims, were you also sexually assaulted? And not asking sexual assault victims, were you also stalked? And I think one of the things that we can think about or should start thinking about is looking at the behaviors that precede a sexual assault, whether it's a stranger or non-stranger sexual assault, And might we consider any of those behaviors as stalking behaviors? And if the offender is making contact with the victim post-sexual assault, which happens more frequently than people realize, could we think about any of those behaviors as well as stalking behaviors? So I actually think there's a much greater link than the research currently bears out, only simply because we haven't asked the question, I think, in the right way. The one exception to this is some of the work that Dr. Dave Lisak and Dr. Paul Miller have done around what's called the undetected rapist, and looking at the premeditative behaviors that often precede sexual assaults. And really, we can look at a lot of those behaviors as stalking behaviors. And so, again, there is an intersection. I think it is much greater than what the research currently indicates.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, I think that was that. We had a question of, will this webinar series be available again? What is happening is that this is a recorded session. So if you go to our website at www.niwrc.org, you can do /webinars, or you can look under our resource tab. These will be available on our website to be viewed as often as necessary. You can use it as a training tool, however you would like to use these resources. So that this will be available. And maybe with Michelle, we could talk about building further. So this is just wonderful to be able to have.
And we would love to explore the opportunities to do even additional ones.
Yes, absolutely. Another question, it says, of the three, domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking, is stalking the most prevalent, or are there statistics?
There are statistics on all three. Actually, I think if you look at the NISVIS, so the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey that I mentioned early on, that was published in 2011 by the CDC, you can see the prevalence rates within the United States around sexual violence, domestic violence, and stalking. I believe the rates of intimate partner violence are, out of the three issues, the highest for women, but I believe the rates of stalking are actually higher for men compared to, say, DV or sexual assault. So it depends on gender, but take a look at the full NISVIS study, and you can see within the report of each of the crimes, but also to some degree where they're intersecting and where they're overlapping. And one thing I want to mention about the NISVIS is that the CDC has been collecting that data every year for the past 4 years. This is intended to be a replicated study, and what we're hearing is going to release their next report sometime this fall, which we're still not entirely sure whether that's going to include 2011, 2012 data, or just 2011 data. That we're still uncertain about, but we hear we're going to have some new data coming out this fall. So definitely keep an eye open for that.
That's great. So Michelle, could you also send that link to the NISVIS report so that we can send out to participants as well?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. Okay.
And if you think of anything after the session ends, my contact information is on the PowerPoint that will be distributed, so you have it. Please don't hesitate to email me if you have any additional questions or are looking for additional technical assistance.
We have some thank yous, great presentation and information, so thank you. I appreciate everybody who participated today in today's webinars. Thank you for your story about what you're going through with the stalker, and I sure hope you have support and people there to help you through that, so that when those feelings are being reawakened again, as you stated, that you're not alone. No, and I really recommend going to the Stalking Resource Center webinar. It is just it is so prevalent and so important to have a dedicated resource specific to this. So definitely take the time to visit and you know, download the resources they have available for you. So if there aren't any further questions, Michelle, did you have any
I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you, Lisa and Tang, for hosting this. It's been a pleasure working with you. I'm looking forward to the next parts of the series. And thank you, everyone who attended today. I know this work is challenging work, and these stalking cases in particular can be very challenging crimes to deal with. And so hopefully this provided you with some information and resources that will make it a little bit easier. And I hope you're able to join us for the next webinars in the series. So just thank you all for the work that you do.
Yes, well, thank you. Again, please join us for our next webinar series is August 27th, and then September 3rd. It's next Wednesday and the following Wednesday. It just helps with the building blocks to understand the depth of what stalking is and what it looks like, and how do we respond, and how do we help be that support person to help victims, because it's a horrific reality that accompanies all of the other violences that we definitely face. So please join us, and we look forward to next week's presentations, and so we thank you. So with that, we will close.